So let's talk about the stories in the collection. So, of course, it begins with the titular story, The Skin Was Once Mine. And I know that you are a big fan and indeed now a friend of Kathe Koja. So when I saw this skin, I couldn't help but recollect "Skin" by Kathe Koja, so I wondered what was there a nod there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm always like riffing on Kathy Koja or Poppy Z. Bright or Clive Barker somehow. Kathy has it's crazy because I read Kathy Koja when I was like an undergrad. I was like 18, 19 in college, and I remember reading Skin for the first time, and I was just completely blown away. I was like, wow, you can actually write about this? Like, you can put these ideas onto paper and people will like buy this book. Like, to me, it was so fantastical that someone had developed this brand of horror, this unique brand of like erotic, just transgressive horror fiction. And I left reading Skin just completely bewitched and like completely transformed, and it's been absolutely insane because the past few years I've gotten to become pretty good friends with Kathy, and she approached me maybe a couple months ago about writing an introduction for her re-release of Skin, which is
Mm,
coming out through Meerkat Press, I think in 2025. And of course, I was so honored, and I immediately, when once she sent me the DM, I like threw up a little because I was like, "Oh my god, Kathy Kojo wants me to write like an introduction for Skin," which is like one of her most iconic books, next to The Cipher, of
mm.
course. Um, but that book like holds so it's just so near and dear to my heart, and for her to ask me to write the intro was just just so incredibly sweet of her, and so kind. And I've found that meeting these icons that I've idolized for years, they are as generous and as giving and as kind as I had imagined and I had hoped that they would be. And for Kathy, that's very, very true. She's just so down to earth, so generous with her time. She's blurbed me a couple times, and has just been such a really good person, really good like role model. And I don't want to assign her that role because I feel like assigning someone the role of role model puts like a lot of pressure on them. And we were talking earlier about like the weight of responsibility, but when I think of who I want to be in like 10 or 15 years, like I hope I have the longevity of someone like Kathy Koja or Poppy Z. Bright, Billy Martin, people who have shaped transgressive horror fiction, but also have been like really positive forces in horror and are just nice, and people say really sweet, kind things about them. Like that's what I want my legacy to be.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as well, like, I mean, you spoke about not wanting to put the weight of responsibility on her, but you must have felt the weight of responsibility on you in writing that introduction. And I mean, how did you even approach that? I mean, what did you do? What was the mindset? What were the rules that you put in place in terms of how you wanted to present that to people?
It took me a few drafts because everything I was coming up with, I thought I just thought I wasn't doing the book justice, and I wasn't doing Kathy justice. And it's an incredible amount of responsibility to be the one leading readers into that book skin, for people who are first timers or people who have read it a couple times and know it pretty intimately. I think I've only read it like a couple of times. I'm not like super like, familiar with it, but I did reread it pretty recently. And I found myself really struggling at first to put into words like how I felt about the book, how much it resonated with me when I first read it, how, it's kind of lasted throughout the years since I first read it in undergrad, college. Um, and once I kind of let go of that responsibility, that like weight that I was feeling on my shoulders, and I was just like, you know what? What would I write if I was just writing like a diary entry of, my thoughts on this book, and something that like no one would ever read, something that would just be for my eyes, and like don't even think that Kathe's going to read it. I really tried to like separate myself from the thought of people judging the intro and looking at it and like critiquing it, analyzing it. And I really just, I mean, it's so cliche, but like I just strived to write from the heart and really tried to write from the the slightly wounded 20-year-old queer kid that desperately needed to see queer rep, messy, complicated queer rep in horror fiction, that I was not seeing it. And to see it in Kathe's work was just like everything I needed. Um, and that's really how I wrote the intro, and it's since been passed on to the publisher. And um, I'm excited for people to experience that book again because it is such a landmark in horror fiction and just transgressive literature in general. I feel like Kathe like just doesn't get the the adulation and the respect that I feel like she deserves, honestly. Like I see her mentioned from time to time, but I feel like a lot of our community like doesn't we have like very short term memories when it comes to like people's contributions to the genre. And I mean, Kathy's like a legend, and I really wish I would just see more. Um, I feel like she's respected. I just maybe I just am I'm yearning for too much. Maybe that's the problem. I really want to see her like venerated and like adored and worshipped the way that like I worship and adore her. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I often wonder, why that is, that there's so many people that are not exactly left behind, but something nearing that, people that, again, not quite forgotten, but it's in that ballpark, and they just don't seem to be as known as one would really hope and as they deserve. And I just wonder if it's because there are so many fantastic writers that it's impossible for one to kind of read and to keep up reading all of the great writers. I wonder if it's something like that. I wonder if it's to do, kind of more cynically with marketing and taste. And
Yeah.
I don't know, but there's a lot of people for various reasons that are not as known as I feel they should be, or as not as celebrated as they should be. I mean, even Jack Ketchum, who I mention a
Yeah.
lot, I mean, for me, he's was one of the best writers to ever do it. And of course, that he is respected and known, but much like Kathe Koji, not on the level. Even Clive Barker, you
Yeah.
know, um, we you mentioned Stephen King and Neil Gaiman, and I think those two are known wider than genre, but Clive Barker, I mean, people who are fans don't even realize they're fans. You know, Hellraiser is bigger than Clive Barker.
I totally agree, and I think it's like a bunch of different problems all coming together at once. I don't know if it's any one single particular thing that you could like attribute this to. I think it definitely is like marketability. I think it's like accessibility of a writer, and maybe even their personality, and you know the way they write, the way they craft their prose. And I think it also has to do with the fact that there are so many authors like competing for attention and just writing phenomenal works. It's hard to keep up. Um, there's also another author that I was thinking of recently, and I was like, why isn't he more like he's respected? He's very well lauded, but you know, it seems like the same sort of authors get like always the airtime, and it's like these other authors don't get the same amount of airtime. And the author I'm thinking of is Thomas Tessier or Tessier.
I was thinking about him the other day. Yeah, he's almost been forgotten. Like,
Totally,
yeah.
totally. His book Finishing Touches, I read that in undergrad. My professor, like, I was obviously very into like erotic extreme horror as an undergrad student, and my professor, who was also like a really big horror junkie, passed me a copy of Finishing Touches and was like, here, keep it, because I feel like you'll get more use out of it than I will. And I read it cover to cover like one day. I was completely blown away. Phenomenal book. um, but I don't see him mentioned much anymore. And that like concerns me sometimes. Like that short memory that like people seem to have, you know, when it comes to like horror fiction. And um another one, Steve Rasnick Tem.
Oh,
He's
yeah.
another one of my favorites. I love his fiction, but I don't see him mentioned like all the time the way I want him to be mentioned. You know what I mean? Um, and I hope I'm not insulting these people by saying like I don't see you mentioned, but I'm only saying this because I really want to see these authors mentioned more in like just casual conversation at like conventions or on podcasts. Like I feel like people don't reference these people a lot anymore.
Yeah, I sometimes feel as well as a podcaster that I've got a responsibility in some way to keep these names alive and to make sure that people are having these conversations about them, that they're on people's radar. And I mean, a few weeks ago, I was saying that this year I'm going to try to make sure that we're having conversations more with people, not just because they've released a book or because there's something coming out, but maybe there was a book that was written in 2002 that I want to talk about, or something from the 80s. And I mean, Thomas Tessier is someone I've been thinking about a lot because I feel like many people don't know, who he is beyond the Nightwalker. And even those who know about the Nightwalker is quite a small audience compared to the audience that he should have. So I think at some point we're going to have to do a Thomas Tessier special, and I mean, if possible, maybe even get him on the podcast.
You
I
absolutely should. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he literally follows This Is Horror on X, so
Oh, amazing.
hopefully we could get him on. But yeah, I mean, I want to kind of keep these conversations going. But do you think about these things as a writer yourself, as someone in an increasing position of prominence? Do you see it as a responsibility, as something you want to do to get those names out there?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's great to post about like your own work and your, promote yourself and get your work out there to readers, but I think like a lot of authors have like a duty to, recall the names that came before us and pay honor to them. I try to post about new books that I'm reading or books that I've read or um, books that came out like in the 80s, 90s. Like books don't have expiration dates, which is what's amazing about books is you can literally discover something that's new to you that's been out for decades, like any sort of entertainment, I suppose. um, but I definitely feel a pressure um, to share my knowledge of horror fiction and horror film. Um, I think the problem is it's a great problem to have. There's just so much being created now that it's hard to keep up, and there's so much excellent horror fiction being produced. I mean, we really are in like an amazing horror boom right now. So perhaps that's why we're seeing like a shorter memory when it comes to like addressing people who have come before. Um, but there are ebbs and flows, and I think I think people like Thomas Tessier and Kathy Koja and you even mentioned like Clive Barker. I mean, I think Clive Barker is like icon status, but to me, but then to other people, I mean, people may not know him that well. They know like Hellraiser, but they don't know of Clive Barker, his work. Um, I think what one of my professors told me when I was in undergrad was that quality writing and excellent creativity always gets noticed eventually. Talent always gets noticed. And I feel like the authors that we're talking about, um, and just authors in general, I feel like because I imagine like a lot of horror authors listen to this podcast. You really have to stay dedicated and stay determined and stay in the game as long as possible, and your time will come. I know that for a fact. It's like not even it's not even like an option. Like it will happen. It just takes time. I feel like it takes time for people to like recognize talent and recognize, oh, that was actually quite good. Like I really liked that. Um, but that gives me hope. That gives me hope that we all collectively will get noticed in one way or the other.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. And I mean, usually it's that perseverance and that persistence. And, unfortunately, the people that didn't get noticed, it's like, oh, you bowed out before it was time. So don't bow out. Keep
Yeah.
going.
Just persevere.
Yeah.
I know it's easier said than done, and I know there are so many reasons to quit, and there are so many reasons to just not write and just hang up your hat and just say, you know what, it's not for me anymore. But when it's good, it's really good. And
Mm.
even in your darkest moment, you know that to be true. So just just keep on keeping on is really my mantra. Like just I'm just keep doing you and keep being true to yourself, and you will find your readers.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, returning back to your collection, now with the title story, much like Things Have Gotten Worse, it is an epistolary tale. Do you think this is a format you'll always return to? Is it a format that you think people expect you to return to? Is it kind of like if we go to see Europe, we hope that they will play the final countdown. Is it Black Sabbath playing Paranoid?
I definitely think it's like my calling card at this point. I feel like it's something that I've kind of established myself as, okay, Eric's probably going to pull out something epistolary related. Um, I really enjoy writing in that format. I really enjoy writing, with the idea of like journal entries or IM instant messages, stuff like kind of like found footage, but like in literature fiction form. Um, I get a lot of enjoyment from that, and I think it's something that I probably will continue. The I've been working on a few new projects, and it definitely incorporates like elements of mixed media in these pieces. Um, I think it's something that I'll always work. It will always work itself into my work, no matter what. Um, I just find it really fascinating to write from those varying points of view and kind of create like a little puzzle for my readers. I think it's really interesting.
And in terms of an introduction to this story, I mean, we spoke a little bit previously about a spoiler, but what we haven't, in fact, got into is what is the origin story for this? How did the story come about?
That's a great question. I think that the genesis for this story was really me wanting to explore cycles of trauma, and especially like in a family setting, how we kind of seem to inherit trauma from our parents, and then that's passed down to us, and in turn we pass it down to our offspring or people we interact with, people we love. And I think, if I remember correctly, I was just thinking about that one day, how um inherited trauma seems to be like something that is pretty prevalent, what I think, in family, like in the family dynamic. And I thought of a situation, like a narrative with someone who inherits this kind of trauma and then passes it on to somebody else, but in turn really gets punished for it. And that's, the end of the piece, where that's like the twist at the end of the piece is, it's all about surviving your worst moment, but how surviving is almost like a worse form of punishment than actually dying. And I think that that's really frightening. And I talk about that at the beginning of the story, The Skin Was Once Mine, and I loop it around back to the end of the piece, where the main character, spoiler alert, she finds herself in a situation that she cannot escape from now. It's like inevitable. She's worked herself into this literal grave, and she needs to come to terms with that. And it's all because of the trauma that she's inherited from her father, from her mother, and from this new person in her life that she didn't really know about. Um, and I think the piece says a lot about, like I said before, like just about surviving things, about enduring things. I think there's a line in this piece where it's like there's nothing romantic about becoming a survivor. And it's true. Like, becoming a survivor means that you've experienced such suffering, such agony. There's no poetry in that. I don't think there's um you know, there's there might be like empowerment that you've survived, but it's a difficult thing that you've overcome. And it was difficult when you went through it, and it's difficult to look back on it. At least that's what I think. When I think of my own things that I've gone through and things that I've endured, yes, it's empowering that I'm on the other side and that I'm looking back on it, but it's painful to like think of those things and go through those moments. Um, and that's really another major piece of what the story is about, and what the whole collection is about, really, too.
Yeah, I mean, I think here you've encompassed the theme, the concern that is threaded throughout, because it's about inheritance or disease or compulsion or things that are growing inside us, that there are things that we have no control over, malevolent things that are kind of thrust into our life. And it's like, what do we do when we are faced with this trauma, when we are faced with something out of our control? How do we survive it? Do we survive it? What are the next steps? And I mean, it is a concern that's kind of been throughout your work, but I feel it has never been so present as it is here in this collection.
I definitely agree. And I think I wonder if I'm grappling with my own mortality more lately, if I'm just thinking about like death and surviving, like getting through life more. Um like for instance the second story in this book, Seedling, that if we could just, if you're okay with jumping to that story for a little bit.
Of
um,
course, yeah.
that piece is really influenced by me coming to terms with my parents' mortality and how I view them, how I might react if I got the call one morning that, my mom had passed away or my dad had died. I don't like thinking about those moments, but um, I do struggle with OCD, with obsessive thoughts, and those thoughts do come to me from time to time, and they are incredibly upsetting. And writing that piece was really therapeutic in a lot of ways because it allowed me to kind of play in that world, that make believe world. It's not going to be make believe for long, unfortunately, because we all will get that call eventually that, our parent is no longer with us. Um, but writing horror for me is just super cathartic because it allows me to face my anxieties and my troubles in a really controlled environment. And that's what that piece did most of all for me, Seedling, was it allowed me to really explore why I feel this way and just really come to terms with their inevitability, like the inevitability of their demises eventually. I don't love thinking about that, but it's something that I feel like we all do need to consider at one point or another. It's not something that we can ignore. And I think that speaks to transgressive fiction in general. Transgressive horror fiction makes us confront things that we don't necessarily want to experience, but they are necessary in some ways. And I was talking about this on another podcast recently, how this kind of horror fiction isn't for everyone for all the time. It's not something that I would recommend you read 24/7, eat, sleep, and breathe, but it's something that maybe you need when you need it. It's something that is necessary when it is necessary, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And if I think about this collection, I feel that whilst it is all cohesive, it all very much builds from the first to the final story. I kind of see the opening story and Seedling as a pairing, and then
Hmm.
I see all the parts of you that won't easily burn and Prickle as another pairing, because the first two, it's they're much more concerned with fractured family relationships, what home is, what home isn't, and kind of navigating these uncomfortable relationships, being there for people in spite of the struggle, in spite of the strained relationships. Whereas the final two parts, they almost take a kind of funny games turn. There's a little bit more kind of sadistic and messed up comedy and play. I do think they're more playful pieces, even though it's a type of play that will only appeal to a certain type of person. And I think as well, whilst the first two are more to do with family, the final two, they're more to do with romantic relationships and sometimes forbidden romantic relationships and fetishes and deviance. And so yeah, I'm not even sure if there's a question attached to that, but that was an observation that I noted.
I appreciate that. I feel like the first two stories are very somber and quiet. As quiet as you can be in like an Eric LaRocca story, obviously. And then the second set of stories, All the Parts of You and Prickle, I think you're absolutely right. I hadn't really considered that, but there is like a playfulness to them and kind of a deviance, but like a wicked, like sort of winking, flirty, almost like, you like this, but maybe you don't like it, but I think you do like it. That kind of like sultry smugness. I don't know how to describe it, but I definitely think you're right. But I think more than anything throughout the collection, what I really strive to create, what I hope was, and I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, was like that escalation of violence. And I think that's why I think, reflecting on it more, I think maybe that's why my agent and manager suggested editing the first story so much, was because if you start at 10, you have nowhere to go. You have nowhere to go once you've kind of uh, exploded and just made things depraved and cruel and sadistic. You have nowhere to grow, really. And I feel like the stories are almost like a perfect escalation of violence and depravity. You get the sort of trauma and abuse in This Skin Was Once Mine, then you get the more like perverted, like cosmic body horror in Seedling, and then it goes into like Clive Barker, uh, kinky horror fetish territory in All the Parts of You, and then finally you just get this like just really cruel, sadistic note at the end of the collection with Prickle, where it just like completely turns up the volume to like 11 and ends on that really shocking moment and just leaves you there. And I think I don't know if any of that was planned, but I guess in some ways, like maybe I did plan it that way. Maybe my subconscious was telling me to structure it that way while I was writing all of the pieces, because I did write them in order, like I said. Um, so yeah, I'm glad that I feel like I'm discovering things about the book the more I talk about it, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, this is something that came up when we were talking to Kathe Koja, and she said that, a story continues to evolve and to be told past the point of writing, the reader's interpretation and the discussion that adds more layers to it. And so I do find, with my own work, through conversations about it, you almost learn more, you uncover more. I mean, I think uncover is probably right. It was always there, but even you as the writer didn't see it, and then it's like, this is what's going on.
So that's a huge reason as to why I sometimes will check reviews, because sometimes, and I think I can't remember if I've said this on this show, or but I've said it somewhere before. I learn a lot about my own writing by reading other people's reaction to it. And I will learn things that I hadn't considered before about something that I had sat with for like 2 or 3 years. And it will completely shock me and like remold my like brain chemistry. But it is so rewarding when that happens. And I love that interaction between reader and author. And that's a really big reason why I don't like when sometimes readers will ask me, well, what did you definitively mean by this? I don't like to answer those questions because I feel like it's more interesting if it's your interpretation of what I meant as opposed to me telling you exactly what I meant, if that makes sense. I would much rather us like I would much rather create the work. Maybe it's figurative, maybe it's like metaphorical. Um, and then you as the reader like interact with it and come to the table with different ideas, and you bring your own you bring your own concepts, your own pasts and histories to it, and that informs, the way you think about the piece. I think that that's where like literature stems from. I feel like that relationship between reader and author, it's like this unspoken agreement that like I've written this work and you're going to interpret it however you choose to interpret it based on your past and your preferences and what have you. Um, I love that. I think that that's just so exciting.
And I think the question, what did you definitively mean by whatever, is almost an impossible one to answer because, much like we said, you're a different person every single day. I mean, what does any action ever definitively mean? That's a lot of gravitas to put on a single action. I mean, what is love definitively? That you can't answer that. It's a verb. It's changing. It's ever evolving. So I
Right.
don't I don't know if there's ever a definitive meaning behind anything.
I agree. And I mean, the films and the books that I love, I'm still struggling to decipher them and what they mean. And I'll probably continue to work out those riddles as long as I'm alive. And I don't like having all the answers. I feel like a lot of readers maybe prefer to have everything like tied up in like a neat little bow, but that's I like things that are messy and that are complicated and that challenge me. And like I'm thinking to myself, well, what did he mean by that? Like what did the author mean by this? And that's what's exciting, you know? That's that's what challenges us and keeps us engaged in literature.
And I think too that art can have a different meaning for you at a different time. And just because the new meaning is uncovered, it doesn't belittle, it doesn't invalidate the old meaning. It's like that's the meaning it had for me then. This is the meaning it has for me now.
Right, it's allowed to change. Absolutely.
But one of the concepts and the ideas, particularly in the opening story, is this notion of home and what home is. And indeed, in this story, there's the challenge, the idea that home doesn't exist when you grow up.
No.
Home is something that you outgrow. I wonder how much truth do you think there is there? What is home to you? And does the idea that it can be outgrown resonate with you?
I think it's something that I think about a lot, and it's something that uh, makes me kind of sad because I grew up in a beautiful home and I had a great fulfilling childhood. I mean, there were elements that I probably would have changed if I could wave like a magic wand and change certain things. I probably would have. Um, but I had a very like fulfilling and pleasant childhood. But once I reached a certain age, I realized that you do outgrow that comfort and that like childish naivete. And the world is a frightening place. I think it is. I think, there's so many horrors in this world. And I don't know what home is. I don't know if I've found home. I don't know if I was almost going to say, like, you find home in like another person, but then, like, can you trust that other person? Are they really like worthy of you calling them home? I don't know. I struggle with that sometimes, and I do feel kind of restless a lot of the time, wondering like if I will find home.
I wonder if home can be another person without you fully needing to trust them because like everything else, the theme throughout this conversation is that everything changes, everything fluctuates. So I'm not sure that to describe a person or a place as home means that you need to have the guarantee that you will feel safe and comfortable and secure there forever.
Hmm.
You just need to feel safe and comfortable and secure there in the moment, and that's okay, and that can make it or them or whatever it is home.
You look at things more positively than I do, I think.
Yeah, this comes up in a lot of conversations with my friend Kev Harrison, who's also the Sahara news editor and a
Oh,
writer
yeah,
amongst
yeah.
many other things. He has a very bleak view of humanity, and I'm always trying to find the light, even if there's only a little glimmer. But I think the reason as to that is because I'd prefer to live in a world where there is light, where there is hope. And even if it were to turn out that there wasn't, probably in my own delusion in this hypothetical situation, I would feel more positive. And I
I like
think,
that.
feeling happy, feeling positive is something that has got me through things. I mean, people know that the last 3 years, particularly not the previous, but the two before, were very, very bleak. And I don't know if I didn't believe that there would be light at some point. I'm not sure that I'd still be here because what would be the point? But
Mhm.
I think in a bizarre way, and it all sounds terribly cliche, but in having endured darkness and then found that later there is light, there is joy, there is hope, it kind of sets me up that if in the future there are other periods of intense, almost agonizing, excruciating darkness, then I will be able to remember that there were also periods after darkness where there is light. I think that's what keeps me going. And yeah, in a way, enduring difficult times, enduring darkness has enabled me to believe more in the light. I don't know. Other times, I feel oddly appreciative that it's me who has endured some of these things and not other people, because some people, who are wired differently, I'd be like, forget it, it's too dark, I'm out.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's interesting how I've been able to endure these battles so far. Hopefully,
Yeah.
it'll continue.
Yeah, no, I love that you have that attitude, and I strive to stay, somewhat positive. It's difficult. It's more difficult for me sometimes, but um, I'm really lucky because I do have like a really great support system around me, and I have people that really care, and um, I'm one of those people that needs uh I need care from others sometimes. Like I can't do it on my own. I need that push from other people. And I've always been like that. And I'm not ashamed of that or anything. Um, but it makes me really grateful for, like, my boyfriend and my parents. But it also frightens me and makes me really scared of the moment when they may not be there and I have to do it on my own. And I think that's where a lot of my writing stems from. A lot of, like, that's the wound that I write from a lot, that, like, you know, being left behind or being the only one left. Um, that's just, it's something I think about, and I work that into my writing as much as possible.
Yeah, I think sometimes maybe my optimism looks easy or that it's not a struggle to some people outside of me, which is of course everybody. But it can be a struggle, it can be difficult, but I do it in spite of that. So I don't want anyone to think it's easy or oh I wish I was built like Michael David Wilson. He seems to find positivity easy. No, it's difficult, but I do it in spite of that difficulty. And sometimes I don't even know where that comes from, but I'm glad that it's there. And in terms of the fear of being alone, in terms of your boyfriend not being there, your parents not being there, and then being alone, I mean, it's a very natural fear. And I mean, one would hope and one would trust that even though there'll be different people there for you at different times within your life, that you'll never truly be alone. And I feel this might be the optimism inadvertently coming out again, but like, if we're putting this positivity and this joy and this kindness into the world, then people are receptive to that, and you're kind of given that back. And you can see that, even throughout your career. You mentioned Kathe and you've mentioned Bentley Little before, and there's just the way in which they have responded to you. So it's a completely natural fear that you might be alone one day, but I don't think it will manifest in reality, and you certainly don't deserve that. So I try my best to not fixate on it too much, even though I know that I can fixate on these weird situations. I think in a way it's part of being a horror writer.
Absolutely. I appreciate that you said that. That's very, very sweet, and I'm gonna hold on to that in my dark moments.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, mentioning Seedling before, and we mentioned Nods. Obviously, naming a character Clive was an obvious
Yeah,
Clive Barker
yeah.
nod. That's not one that we really need to decipher or unpack
No,
too
probably
much.
not.
But as I think you said before, that this is the weird fiction piece. This is like kind of your cosmic horror, your David Cronenberg kind of moment. I felt, and I mean, I noted with this, and of course with all the parts of you that won't easily burn. This is about kind of, I mean, it's not just about this, but it touches on the theme of almost forbidden pleasures or unusual kinks and deviances, because there's a real pleasure in like kind of protruding the father's wound. And then in all the parts of you that won't easily burn, there's the putting the glass inside one's body. And it's like, oh, okay, there's a bit of a kick to that. There's something going on there. And I mean, I feel that, like, I mean, there is as well, like, a kind of metaphor, and like in terms of people being concerned as to what other people's pleasure is and what they're enjoying, and trying to get into their business and being like, oh, you're not allowed to enjoy this. But I wondered if we could speak to that.
Yeah, well, so I did an interview recently for a local Boston magazine, and we talked about um, the seedling and all the parts of you that won't easily burn, in particular. And what I noticed when I was talking about both of those stories is that there is almost a level of like coded queerness that is in both stories. In Seedling, you have the son who has come home to discover his mother's corpse is still in the house, and his father is like pleading with him, like, please say your goodbyes to your mother before they take her away. And then he starts to recognize these like wounds that are growing on his body, and then his father has the same sort of affliction, and he starts like exploring these wounds, like his own, his father's. Um, but there's something like incestuous about it, and there's something like coded, like queer about it, where it's like a different kind of sexuality that I'm like exploring, and the same sort of thing happening in all the parts of you that won't easily burn. And I don't know if this was intentional. I mean, possibly. When I look back on it, it seems like maybe I did mean this to correlate the way it did. But you have in all the parts of you that won't easily burn, you have Enoch, the main character of that piece, who uh, discovers himself developing an unusual fetish for slicing himself and inserting little tiny broken pieces of glass inside the wound. I mean, there's another coded example of queerness going on, and I think that thread of queerness is running throughout the entire collection. It's not just limited to those two stories. You have that same level of queerness, that coded level of queerness in The Skin Was Once Mine, with the ambiguously gay Ambrose, who's like the pseudo villain of the piece. And then you have uh, similar coded interactions between Mr. Chesler and Mr. Spiro in Prickle. Maybe they love each other, maybe they don't. Um, it's just interesting how I think I was really playing like homage to a lot of those like 20th century liter fiction short stories that I read, like pieces by like Roald Dahl, or you know, I'm trying to think of other ones. Uh, Authors that are not explicitly in the horror canon, but are like horror adjacent. And I think I was really like paying homage to those moments where authors would make these coded gestures between two male characters or two women characters. Um, for instance, like I was a huge fan, still am, of Tennessee Williams. I mean, phenomenal playwright who a lot of his pieces are um, examples of coded queer sexuality. I mean, a lot of his protagonists in his plays are inserts of himself and other people he knew. Um, and I think I was really playing with that. But it's especially coded. This collection, "The Skin Was Once Mine," is definitely coded in like explicit queerness. And I find that really interesting to play around with.
Because you bring up Tennessee Williams, it occurs to me that as this collection progresses, it becomes easier to adapt each of the stories into a play, with
Oh
Prickle
yeah.
being the obvious kind of most easy, almost Samuel Beckett two characters
No.
format. But I mean, it would not take a lot to adapt all the parts of you that won't easily burn into a play either. That's quite a tight cast of people.
And that's intentional, especially for Prickle. I love any sort of piece that is limited in setting and limited in character. I love to watch any sort of drama, play, film where it's one setting and a tight cast of characters. I love to see what's going to happen in that place. Where's the conflict going to come from? How is the space going to change based on the way the characters interact with one another? How are the characters going to in turn change the way they interact with one another? Are there going to be physical changes, or is it all going to be, figurative? Um, that to me is just really exciting as a viewer. So when I sat down to write Prickle, I really wanted to write something that was one location, two characters, and almost write it like a Samuel Beckett play or like a Tennessee Williams drama, or even the Zoo Story by Edward Albee, which is about two men who meet in a park on a bench. Just they have no prior relationship like they do in my story. They just happen to meet one another, um, if I recall that correctly. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, I would love to see adaptations of my work as theater and film and anything.
And another observation when reading All the Parts of You That Won't Easily Burn and Prickle. So, with all the parts, I felt throughout there's a foreboding, disquieting sense of horror. Even though it's light and it's more playful, it is a horror story. But for me, and I don't know how other readers reacted. You might know more because you've read some of the reviews, but the last line in all the parts almost turned it into more a comedy because of how absurd it had become. Whereas with Prickle, it is lighter in tone, it is more a funny games comedy throughout. Although last time on the podcast I said I thought Funny Games was a comedy, people were like, you're one messed up guy.
Yeah.
But then the final line of Prickle makes it much more horrific. So was that intentional that you've got right? The third story is more horror than final line comedy.
Mhm.
The final story more comedy. Final line horror.
Yeah, I mean, it's about inverting those expectations and playing with what are people going to expect when they open this story and when they, go through these pages and live through these characters. With all the parts of you that won't easily burn, I wanted to structure it uh, almost like a Martin McDonagh play. I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's like a really exceptional playwright. Um, he wrote a behanding in Spokane, I believe. I'm trying to think. He wrote The Pillowman, a bunch of really just like awesome, like darkly comic, absurd plays. And I really wanted to write something that started off really grounded in that like horror space, like that sort of Clive Barkery fetish disturbing horror content, and then the final scene of the piece is like this grand guignol type reveal where there's like gore everywhere. It's just completely absurd, and the last line like turns it into almost like a farce. And I really love playing with readers' expectations, and I feel like that line is so out of left field that it will surprise people, just the same way that the ending of Prickle will surprise readers in what happens at the very end of that piece, where it starts off like really lighthearted and, two old friends, these elderly gentlemen who are meeting in the park. One's been away for a while, because he had medical issues, was away on holiday, and he finally came back and meeting up with his friend, and they revive this game where they enact little cruelties on people who pass by. And it starts off like pretty innocuous, and then it just goes up to 11, like I said. And I really think that the strength of that piece is in how lighthearted it starts and then how it ends so devastatingly. And I think it was absolutely intentional. It was something I was very, very much thinking about while writing the entirety of that piece. And I think, if I remember correctly, um, I write so much, so I sometimes forget like the process of writing each story. But if I remember correctly, I knew what the final line of that story was going to be before I even started writing the piece, and that's why I called it Prickle.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean that there's so many narrative threads and callbacks and crossovers throughout these four stories. I mean, a lot that we haven't even mentioned, but I mean, it occurs to me that if we think about the end of all the parts of you that won't easily burn and something or someone who is found, I mean, you can almost link that into the title story. You could have, if you'd wanted to, have literally had them cross over. It wouldn't have taken
True.
too much, but that there's just so much going on. And I feel this is a collection where, it would benefit from multiple readings, because I know that there are going to be little tricks that you've employed that I haven't picked up on yet. And yeah, it's always very exciting discovering those crossovers and those Easter eggs.
Thank you so much. That means a lot. I really appreciate that.
And in the title story, so we're going back to spoiler territory. So you mentioned, somebody who is discovered, shall we say. When you were writing that, did you think about, or was the real life horror of Joseph Fritzl someone that sprang to mind? Because it occurs to me there's quite a few parallels there.
That name isn't ringing a bell. Who is that?
So Joseph Fritzl is the, I believe, Austrian guy who kept his daughter imprisoned in a basement for something like 18 years.
Oh, okay, gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, I vaguely know. I just didn't recognize the name. Um, yeah, I mean that story is so entrenched in trauma and just depravity. Um, and going back to the conversations I had with my agent and my manager, I really am glad that I listened to them and took some elements out, because some of it was just too much. And there comes a point when, I think I said this earlier, if you start at like an 11, you can't go anywhere from there. And to start off a story collection with one of like a really graphic rape scene, or just a scene of abuse, like it's really difficult to go anywhere, and it's probably a little difficult for readers to trust you in some way, that you're going to be tactful and that you're going to like guide them through this collection. um I I definitely think I made the right choice listening to my agent and my manager about scaling back some of those scenes. Um, but there are definitely moments. I mean, real life is stranger than fiction a lot of the time, and there are definitely cases I've come across that I thought, "Wow, this would be like perfect for an Eric LaRocca story." It seems like it was ripped right out of something I would write. Um, and yeah, I mean, I'm always kind of like looking on different forums for like, weird shit that has happened online, or uh weird cold cases or things that have been unexplained. I really find that fascinating. Um and at the end of the day, like, horror is about humanity, and it's about our empathy too. It's about like recognizing the fact that we're observing or living through a character that is going through the very worst moment of their life, and we hopefully have the empathy to identify with that and suffer along with them.
All right. Well, I think that is a fantastic summation of not only the collection, but of your entire body of work. And it is always a pleasure chatting to you and getting to explore your work and your mind. And so, once again, thank you so much for being so generous with your time.
Oh my gosh, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, and for reading the collection. I really am so honored that it resonated with you. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, this is an absolutely fantastic collection. And I hope that people who haven't will go out and will buy, the new collection or the forthcoming collection. And I hope too that they'll pick up the previous two, because like you said, I mean, it almost it forms a trilogy. They are connected and they show kind of different shades, I suppose, of your evolution as a writer, of your journey as a writer. So yeah, there's a lot for people to discover who haven't already, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Where can our listeners connect with you?
So I'm on Twitter/X at Hysteric Teeth, and I'm also on Instagram, same handle, Hysteric Teeth, and I'm also on Facebook and Blue Sky as well. Although I haven't been posting as much on Blue Sky lately. I should probably post more there. But I'm pretty active on X and Instagram for the most part.
All right. Do you have any final thoughts to leave the listeners and viewers with?
So many thoughts. Yeah, no, I'm very grateful that I get to continue to write horror, and really honored that people seem to be responding to it, good and bad. I appreciate all of it, and I just hope horror continues to thrive, and hopefully I'll be back next year and we can talk about my new novel.
All right. Looking forward to it.